The moment Pearl Grayson stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, the dust rose around her ankles like it was trying to swallow her whole, and she let it, because she had nowhere left to run and no particular reason to care whether the earth took her back into itself right then and there. She was 24 years old, and she felt ancient. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Chisholm Trail, a place where cattle drives ended, and men celebrated their arrival with whiskey and loose money, and the kind of recklessness that came from months of hard riding beneath an unforgiving sun. It was not the kind of town a woman came to when she was looking for a fresh start. It was the kind of town a woman came to when she had exhausted every other option, and Pearl Grayson had done exactly that. She carried a single carpetbag stitched along one side with blue thread that had faded to the color of a winter sky. Inside that bag was a change of dress, a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, a comb with 2 teeth missing, and exactly $4.30, which was everything she owned in the world. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving behind debts that swallowed the family farm in Missouri whole, and her older brother Thomas had made it plain after the funeral that there was no room for her in his new life with his new wife in their new house built on the very land that had once belonged to all of them. She had not argued with Thomas. She had packed her bag, kissed the doorframe of the old farmhouse one last time, and left. She had spent 3 months in Wichita working as a laundress before the proprietress of the establishment discovered that Pearl had no reference letters and let her go without ceremony. She had spent 6 weeks after that in a boarding house outside of Dodge City, taking in mending work, until the boarding house burned to the ground on a dry October night, and she had barely escaped with her bag and her boots. And now here she was in Caldwell, standing in the street with the afternoon sun pressing down on her shoulders like a firm and indifferent hand. The town had a main street, a livery stable, a saloon called the Red Spur, a general store, a small church with a listing steeple, a barber shop, and a building with a sign that read Whitmore's Hotel and Boarding House. Pearl counted her money in her palm and walked toward the hotel. Mrs. Whitmore was a woman of considerable size and considerable opinions, and she had both on full display when Pearl came through her door. She looked Pearl up and down with the practiced eye of a woman who had seen every variety of desperate person pass through Caldwell and had learned to sort them quickly. "Room and board is $2 a week," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Meals included, but I serve supper at 6 and not a minute after." "I can pay for 1 week," Pearl said. "I'll have work by then." Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything honest," Pearl said, and she meant it plainly without any edge to the words. Mrs. Whitmore seemed to respect that. She gave Pearl a room on the 2nd floor with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the livery stable, and she said nothing more about the matter. That evening, Pearl sat at the supper table with 4 other boarders, 3 of whom were traveling cattle buyers, and one of whom was a young schoolteacher named Miss Alma Brent, who had arrived in Caldwell 2 weeks earlier to take up a position at the town's small schoolhouse. Alma was 22, bright-eyed and earnest, and she attached herself to Pearl with the particular warmth of a woman who was also far from home and glad to find another of her kind. "Have you come to teach?" Alma asked. "No," Pearl said. "I have no formal schooling past the 8th grade. Are you meeting someone here?" "No." Alma absorbed this with a small nod and did not press further, which Pearl appreciated enormously. The next morning Pearl was up before dawn. She went to the general store, which was run by a man named Abe Sully who had kind eyes behind spectacles and a wife who did the bookkeeping from a stool behind the counter. Pearl asked if they needed any help. Mr. Sully said they did not. She went to the barber shop and asked the barber, a Mr. Callahan with impressive whiskers, if he needed anyone to launder his linens. He said he had a woman who did that already. She walked the length of the main street twice and found no immediate openings, and she was about to turn back toward the hotel when she noticed a smaller building set slightly behind the Red Spur Saloon, which she had not registered the day before because she had been too tired to look carefully at anything. The sign above the door said Crawford Ranch Supply and Tack. The door was propped open with a brick, and from within came the smell of leather and saddle oil and something like pine resin. Pearl walked in. The interior was orderly in the way that a working space achieves when its owner has a particular kind of mind. Not perfectly neat, but functionally arranged, with saddles draped over wooden stands and bridles hung on pegs and shelves stocked with everything a working ranch hand might need. At the back of the space, leaning over a workbench and working all through a thick piece of leather with concentration, was a man. He was tall, even bent over the bench, with broad shoulders that strained his cotton shirt and dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck because it had been too long between haircuts. He was somewhere in his late 20s or perhaps 30, with the kind of face that the sun had worked on honestly, weathered at the corners of the eyes and along the jaw. He did not look up immediately, and Pearl stood in the doorway for a moment watching him work, and she noticed his hands, which were large and careful and moved with a precision that seemed at odds with his size. "Be right with you," he said, without looking up. "Take your time," Pearl said. He did look up then, and Pearl saw that his eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that rivers turn in autumn, changeable and deep. He straightened, setting his awl down with a quiet click. "Sorry," he said. "I thought you were Hendricks coming to pick up his breastplate." He looked at her in a way that was not rude but was thorough, the way a man looks when he is trying to understand a situation. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" "My name is Pearl Grayson," she said. "I arrived yesterday. I'm looking for work and I noticed your sign." He wiped his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. "Benjamin Crawford," he said. "This is my shop." "Do you need help?" Pearl asked. He considered her in a way that felt honest rather than dismissive. "What kind of help are you thinking?" "I can keep books," Pearl said. "My father kept a farm and I did all his accounting from the time I was 12. I can also organize, clean, take inventory, write correspondence. I'm good with numbers and I'm reliable." Benjamin Crawford looked around his shop as if seeing it through fresh eyes. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Grayson. I've been meaning to get my ledgers in order for about 6 months. I've been so busy with the trail business that the paperwork has gotten away from me." He paused. "I can offer you $4 a week. 6 days, Monday through Saturday, 8 in the morning until 5. That's the best I can do right now." Pearl did not let herself feel the relief that moved through her, because she had learned that relief could undo a person if they let it show too soon. "That's fair," she said. "I'll start tomorrow." Benjamin nodded. 8 o'clock, he said. "I'll be here." She turned to go and he said, "Miss Grayson," she looked back. "There's a key for the front door. I'll have one made for you, in case I'm out on a supply run and you get here before me." It was a small thing, a key, a practical matter of business. Pearl understood this. And yet something about the casual trust embedded in the gesture reached her, in a place she had been keeping carefully shut for a very long time. "Thank you," she said, and went out into the morning. She returned the next day at 8 o'clock sharp, and found the shop already open and Benjamin Crawford working on a length of rawhide at the bench. He showed her the ledgers without ceremony. 3 battered books with columns of figures entered in a handwriting that was earnest but inconsistent, and Pearl sat down at the small desk near the window and began to work. She was good at it, the sorting and the ordering, the way numbers told the truth of a thing when you knew how to read them right. Within 2 hours, she had identified 3 billing errors and 1 order that had never been invoiced at all, which together amounted to nearly $14 owed to Crawford Ranch Supply and Tack. She brought the ledger to Benjamin and showed him, pointing to each entry carefully. He stared at the page, then at her. "How did you find all that in 2 hours?" "The numbers tell you where to look if you pay attention to what they're saying," Pearl said. He laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to come from somewhere genuine rather than from politeness. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father," she said. "He wasn't a perfect man, but he understood that a farm doesn't run on hard work alone. It runs on keeping accurate track of things." Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "Your father taught you well," he said. Pearl looked back at the ledger. "He did," she said simply, and returned to her desk. That was how it began, with numbers and honesty and the particular intimacy of two people working in close quarters with a shared purpose. Benjamin was in and out of the shop throughout the day, coming and going on errands and deliveries, and he had the quality that Pearl appreciated most in a person. He did not fill silence with noise for the sake of it. When he was in the shop, they worked companionably, and sometimes they talked about the business of the day, and sometimes they did not say anything at all, and both varieties of time felt equally natural. By the end of her first week, Pearl had put the ledgers in proper order, written 6 overdue invoices, and begun a new system of inventory tracking that she explained to Benjamin on Saturday afternoon. He listened to her with his full attention, which was another thing she noticed about him, the way he actually listened rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "This will save you a significant amount of money over a year," Pearl said, spreading the new inventory sheets on his workbench. "I can see that," he said. He was quiet for a moment, studying the papers. "Miss Grayson, I'd like to raise your wage to $5 a week, effective immediately." Pearl looked up. "You don't need to do that. You've already recovered $14 in unbilled accounts, and you've built an inventory system I would never have thought to create," Benjamin said. "I'd be a fool not to pay you what you're worth." Pearl did not know what to say to that, because she had spent the last year being shown repeatedly and in various ways exactly what other people believed she was worth, and the number had generally been very low. She straightened the papers unnecessarily. "Thank you," she said. She walked back to Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house that evening and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and allowed herself, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, to feel something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. A cautious warmth, like the first real sun of March that you don't trust yet because you know winter can return. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Pearl arrived at 8, worked through the morning, broke for midday when Benjamin would often bring 2 plates of food from a woman named Consuelo, who ran a small eating establishment out of the back of her home 2 streets over. And Consuelo's food was extraordinary, simple and filling and full of flavor, the kind of cooking that made you understand why people put down roots in a place. They ate these meals, sometimes sitting outside on the bench in front of the shop, watching the street of Caldwell go about its considerable business. The town was genuinely alive in those summer months, with cattle drives coming in from Texas along the Chisholm Trail, and cowboys spending their pay and cattle buyers from Chicago and Wichita moving through, and all the ordinary commerce of a frontier town running alongside it. Pearl watched all of it with a particular attention that Benjamin noticed. "You observe things," he said one afternoon, watching her watch a group of trail-weary cowboys moving down the street toward the red spur. "You learn more by watching than by talking," Pearl said. "Where did you come from?" Benjamin asked. It was not an intrusive question the way he asked it. It was simply curiosity, offered without pressure. Pearl told him about Missouri, about the farm, about her father's death and the debts and Thomas and his neat dismissal of her. She told it plainly, without self-pity, because it was simply the shape of what had happened. Benjamin listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "That's a great deal for one person to carry." "Everyone carries something," Pearl said. "True," he agreed. "But not everyone carries it alone." She looked at him, and he was looking out at the street, not at her, and there was something in his profile, a quietness in his jaw, that made her think he knew something about carrying things alone. "What about you?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I grew up in Tennessee, came west after the war. My father and my younger brother both died at Chickamauga. My mother passed 2 years later. I had nothing left that tied me to Tennessee, so I came west." He said it with the same plainness she used for her own story, fact by fact, no flourishes. "I worked cattle drives for 5 years, saved what I could, bought this shop 4 years ago. I'm 30 years old, I own my building, and this shop is the first thing I've ever had that felt truly mine." "You've built something real," Pearl said. "Trying to," he said. And then he smiled just slightly, the way he sometimes did, a small and private thing. Having a bookkeeper who actually understands bookkeeping helps considerably. She laughed, and the laugh surprised her because she had not laughed like that, genuinely and without effort, in a very long time. October came and cooled the town down. The great cattle drives of the summer season wound down, and Caldwell grew quieter, settling into the particular peace of a frontier town in the fall. And Pearl found she loved it. The way the afternoons turned gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke, and the streets were less crowded, and the whole world seemed to slow down just enough to breathe. She and Benjamin fell into deeper conversation as the weeks passed, the way two people do when they work together and begin to trust each other enough to say the things that are real. He told her about the drives, about the land in West Texas, about the particular loneliness of moving cattle across 500 miles of open country, and the strange way that loneliness could become almost beautiful if you let yourself be inside it rather than fighting it. She told him about her mother, who had died when Pearl was 14, and about the garden her mother had kept, and how she could still remember exactly what it smelled like in June, roses and black-eyed Susans, and the particular green smell of tomato plants in the heat. One afternoon in late October, Benjamin came into the shop from a supply run looking troubled. He set a crate down harder than necessary and stood with his hands on his hips, staring at nothing. Pearl looked up from the ledger. "What happened?" He turned. "You know Jim Alderton, the rancher east of town. I've seen the name in the accounts. He's been spreading word that my saddle stitching is bad, telling buyers to take their business elsewhere." Benjamin's jaw was tight. "I mended 3 saddles for him last spring and he was perfectly satisfied, paid without complaint. Now he's suddenly telling half the ranchers in the county that I use inferior leather." Pearl studied him. "Why?" "Because I wouldn't sell him my building." Benjamin sat down on the edge of a saddle stand, heavy with frustration. "He made me an offer 2 months ago, wanted to turn this whole block into a cattle brokerage. I said no. I guess he decided to make me regret it." Pearl thought for a moment. "What do your records show from his account?" "What do you mean?" "Your receipts, your order logs, his invoices. Everything documented from when you worked his saddles. Do you have all of it?" Benjamin looked at her. "I have some of it." "Find everything," Pearl said. "Every scrap of paper connected to Jim Alderton. The date you received his saddles, what work you did, what leather you used, who supplied it when he picked them up, and how much he paid. If your work was good and he paid without complaint, the paper trail will say so." Benjamin stared at her for a moment. Then he went to the filing cabinet, which Pearl had reorganized 2 months ago, and began pulling folders. They spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through the documentation, Pearl laying it out in order on the workbench and writing a clean summary of the entire transaction that showed, clearly and in sequence, exactly what had been done, when, and with what materials, and the fact that Alderton had paid in full and signed the receipt. "Can I keep this summary?" Benjamin asked when she handed it to him. "I made 2 copies," Pearl said. "One for your files, and one for you to show to anyone Alderton has been talking to." He looked at the papers for a long moment, and then he looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, something somewhere between gratitude and something else, something quieter and less easy to name. "Pearl," he said. She noticed he had used her given name for the first time, and so did he, because he paused slightly after saying it as though he had not intended to and had surprised himself. He did not correct it. "Thank you, I mean that." "It's just records," Pearl said. "No," he said quietly. "It's not just records." She looked away first, back at the ledger, and he went to the door to close up for the evening, and neither of them said anything more about it. But he kept calling her Pearl, and she noticed every single time. The situation with Alderton did not disappear overnight. 3 of Benjamin's regular customers came into the shop that week, awkward and apologetic, asking questions that showed they had heard the rumors. Benjamin showed each of them Pearl's carefully organized summary of the work, the receipts, the materials documentation, and the signed satisfaction. One customer, A rancher named Haskell, who had been doing business with Crawford Ranch Supply since the day it opened, looked at the papers and then shook Benjamin's hand firmly and ordered 30 feet of high-quality rope on the spot. The second customer, a woman named Mrs. Parrish, who ran a small horse operation with her husband, read the documentation with her reading glasses perched on her nose and then said, "This is very professionally presented," looking at Pearl with curiosity. "Miss Grayson keeps my books and records," Benjamin said. Mrs. Parrish looked at Pearl with an interest that was not unfriendly. "You do good work," she said. The third customer remained uncertain and took his business elsewhere, and Benjamin let him go without bitterness, because Pearl was discovering, the kind of man who did not spend energy on things he could not change. November arrived with a cold wind off the plains that made the shop feel warmer than ever, and Pearl began to realize that the shop had become, in some way she had not planned for and could not entirely account for, the thing she looked forward to most in each day. Not simply the work, though she genuinely loved the work, the clean satisfaction of well-kept books and an organized system. It was the specific combination of work and Benjamin Crawford's company, which had become something she could not have explained to anyone without feeling exposed. She was not a woman who indulged in romantic thinking. She had not had the luxury of it. But she was honest enough with herself, in the private hours of her narrow room at Mrs. Whitmore's, to acknowledge that something was happening to her that was not simply professional appreciation. When Benjamin laughed, really laughed, at something genuinely funny, which happened more often than she would have predicted for a man who seemed so measured, she felt it in her chest. When he was particularly close to her, leaning over the workbench to look at something she was showing him in the ledger, close enough that she could smell the particular combination of leather and wood smoke and clean cotton that was simply his smell, she noticed her own heartbeat in a way that was inconvenient and undeniable. She filed this information away and did nothing with it, because she was a practical woman in a precarious situation, and she knew with clear-eyed certainty that she had nothing to offer a man like Benjamin Crawford, who had built something real and deserved someone with more to bring to the table than a carpetbag and a talent for bookkeeping. She told herself this firmly on the evenings when it became necessary. November brought with it the matter of Thanksgiving, which Mrs. Whitmore intended to celebrate with considerable seriousness. She asked each of her boarders to contribute something to the meal, and Pearl said she would make a pie if she could use the kitchen on Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. Whitmore said she could. Pearl made a sweet potato pie the way her mother had taught her, with a crust that she worked patiently until it was exactly right and a filling that smelled, when it came out of the oven, so powerfully of warmth and sweetness, and home that Pearl had to stand in the kitchen for a moment with her hands pressed flat on the table, because the ache of it moved through her entire body. She brought the pie to supper, and Mrs. Whitmore's table was full for once, with all 4 regular boarders plus 2 travelers who had come in that afternoon off the stage. Alma Brent, the schoolteacher, was bright and lively and asked Pearl questions about Missouri and laughed easily and was altogether good company, and the meal was warm and generous and Pearl ate well and felt, sitting at that table, a version of belonging that she had not expected to find in Caldwell. The next day at the shop, she brought a slice of pie she had saved in a cloth. "Mrs. Whitmore made the turkey," Pearl said, setting the cloth on Benjamin's workbench, "but the pie is mine." Benjamin untied the cloth and looked at the slice with what could only be described as genuine delight. He was not a man who performed feeling, which was one of the things Pearl had learned about him over 3 months of close observation. When he felt something, it showed authentically, and the delight was completely real. He took a bite. He was quiet for a long moment. "My grandmother made sweet potato pie," he said. "I haven't had it since I was maybe 12 years old." He said it quietly, not looking at her, and Pearl understood that this was not a small thing, and she said nothing in response because there was nothing that needed saying. He ate the whole slice slowly, and she watched him, and neither of them spoke, and it was one of the most intimate things Pearl had ever shared with another person. December in Caldwell was cold and quiet, and the shop was warm, and Pearl began to understand that she had, without planning it, built something in this town. She had regular wages, a room she had come to feel comfortable in, a friendship with Alma Brent that had grown into genuine closeness, and a working relationship with Benjamin Crawford that had grown into something she did not have an accurate word for. She was useful. She was settled. She had even, very cautiously, allowed herself to feel something like safe. It was the middle of December when she made the mistake of letting that feeling show. They had been working late, Pearl finishing the quarterly accounts and Benjamin repairing a particularly complicated Mexican saddle that a trail boss had left in his care. The shop was lit by lamplight, warm and small and quiet, and outside it had started to snow lightly, the first real snow Pearl had seen since leaving Missouri. She had gone to the window to look out at it, because she could not help herself, and she had stood there for a moment watching the snow fall through the lamplight outside, and she had said, without thinking it through first, "I had forgotten that snow could be beautiful." She felt Benjamin come to stand behind her close enough that she could feel his warmth, though he did not touch her. "You've been through a hard stretch," he said quietly. "I'm all right now," she said. "I have work, I have a room, I'm all right." He was quiet. Then he said, "Is that enough for you, Pearl, just being all right?" She turned, and he was right there, closer than she had realized, and she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes because he was a head taller than her, and his gray-green eyes in the lamplight were very serious and very direct. "It's more than I had 6 months ago," she said. "I don't take it lightly. That's not what I asked." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Benjamin," she said very carefully, "I think you might be trying to say something to me." "I think I might be too," he said. There was a slight roughness in his voice that had not been there before. Pearl looked at him, and everything that she had been keeping carefully contained for 3 months was right there on the surface, barely managed, and she made herself take a step back, because she knew herself, and she knew that if she did not step back she was going to say or do something that could not be undone, and she was terrified of what came after that. "I should finish the quarterly figures," she said. Benjamin didn't move for a moment. Then he nodded once and went back to his saddle, and Pearl went back to her desk, and neither of them spoke for the rest of the evening. But she felt his awareness of her the whole time, and she knew he felt hers, and the silence between them was not comfortable the way it usually was. It was charged, full of something unnamed that neither of them had the courage to reach for yet. She walked home through the light snow and told herself everything she had told herself before, that she had nothing to offer him, that she had come to Caldwell with nothing, and had built only the minimum of a life, a rented room and a job, and that was not the foundation a person builds love on. That he deserved someone whole, someone with roots and family and history, not a woman who had been stripped down to just herself by years of loss. She believed all of it. She believed it completely. It was the only thing that made sense, and it did absolutely nothing to quiet the feeling. Christmas came to Caldwell with a simplicity that Pearl found she loved. The church put up a small pine tree, and Mrs. Whitmore hung cedar boughs along her porch railing, and Mr. Sully's general store put a crate of oranges in the window that was an enormous luxury, and sold out in a single afternoon. Pearl bought one orange and ate it slowly in sections, at her window while the town settled into its Christmas quiet. Benjamin closed the shop on Christmas Day, which was a Wednesday, and Pearl found herself at loose ends in a way she had not been for months. She went to the church service in the morning, sitting beside Alma, and afterward walked through the quiet streets feeling oddly unmoored, as though the day without its usual structure had revealed the absence of things she was better off not thinking about too clearly. She went to the shop anyway, in the afternoon. She told herself she simply wanted to check one figure in the ledger that had been troubling her. She was not fooling herself entirely, but she went anyway. Benjamin was there. He was sitting on the bench just inside the door with a cup of coffee, as if he had had the same kind of day she had. He looked up when she came in and did not seem surprised, only quietly glad, which was worse than surprised would have been, because it meant he had been thinking about her too. "I thought I left a figure unbalanced," Pearl said. "The ledger will be there tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. She sat down on the chair nearest the door. "I didn't know what else to do with myself today." "Neither did I," he said honestly. They sat in the quiet shop on Christmas afternoon, and Benjamin made her a cup of coffee from the small stove he kept in the back, and they talked for a long time about things they had not talked about before. He told her about Christmas in Tennessee when he was a boy, before the war took everything, and how his mother used to make a gingerbread that was more sweet than spiced, and how his brother William would eat so much of it he made himself sick every year without fail. He told it laughing, and Pearl could hear the grief underneath the laughter, not as a sad thing but as a real thing, the way love and loss live in the same house once someone is gone. Pearl told him about her mother's Christmas rituals, the specific way she folded napkins into fans, the carols she always sang slightly off-key while she cooked, and how the farm smelled on Christmas morning, hay and wood smoke and something baking, and how she had not realized until these past several years how much she would miss the specific texture of that particular life. "I think we're both people who learned loss early," Benjamin said. He was looking at the wall, not at her. "Yes," Pearl said simply. "I think that's part of why I feel easy with you," he said. "You don't require pretending." Pearl looked at him. He turned to meet her eyes. "Most people need you to perform fine," he said. "They need you to present a certain face so they don't have to reckon with the truth of a thing. You've never once needed that from me." "I suppose I can't afford it," Pearl said, meaning it partly as a joke. "No," he said. "I don't think it's that. I think you're too honest for it. It's one of the things I admire most about you." Pearl was very still. "Benjamin," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "You're going to tell me not to say it. I'm going to tell you that whatever you're thinking, you should think it through very carefully," she said. "Because I am not a simple situation." "I'm not looking for a simple situation," he said. He set his coffee cup down and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at her directly. "Pearl, I think you know how I feel." She did know. She had known for weeks. The knowing was part of what frightened her. "I think you do too," he said. "How you feel." The clock on Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house down the street could be heard distantly through the shop's thick walls, marking the hour. 4 o'clock on Christmas afternoon, and Pearl Grayson sat in the light of a single oil lamp and felt the entire weight of her own life pressing down on her at once. "I have nothing to offer you," she said. Her voice came out very steady because she needed it to. "I want to be honest with you about that. I have a carpetbag, a rented room, and 4 months of wages saved. I have no family who will stand behind me, no property, no history in this place. I have nothing that a person is supposed to bring to this kind of thing." Benjamin was very quiet for a moment. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes, and she could see him processing what she had said, taking it seriously, not dismissing it. Then he said, very quietly, very simply, "You already gave me something I cannot name." Pearl stared at him. He leaned forward a little further, and when he spoke his voice was low and sure. "The day you walked into this shop and found $14 in unbilled accounts, I thought you were competent. The day you built the inventory system, I thought you were extraordinary. The day you brought the sweet potato pie, I thought about you for 3 days afterward and could not tell you why." He paused. "And the day you stood at the window and watched the snow and said you'd forgotten it could be beautiful, I understood that I had been lonely for a very long time and had not known it until I was not lonely anymore. And that was your doing, Pearl. Not the bookkeeping, not the records, you, the particular way you are in the world, honest and careful and alive to things. That's what you gave me, and I cannot name it precisely, but I know what it is, and I know I have never had it before." The silence afterward was absolute. Pearl's hands were in her lap and she was looking at them because she could not look at him without the thing inside her chest undoing itself completely. "I'm afraid," she said. It was the most honest thing she could offer. "Of what?" "Of needing something and losing it," she said. "I've lost everything I've needed before, every time." "So have I," he said. "That doesn't seem like a reason not to try. It seems like a reason to be careful and honest and to go slowly, and to mean every single thing we say to each other." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to leap into anything, Pearl. I'm asking you to let me call on you properly, to let us see where this goes, openly and with clear eyes. That's all." She looked up at him finally. His face was open and serious, and there was no performance in it at all, no calculated charm, no pressure, only the simple and undeniable honesty of a man saying what was true for him. "All right," she said. The word was small. The word contained everything. He exhaled, a breath he had perhaps been holding for some time, and he smiled at her. Not the small private smile she had catalogued over 4 months, but something larger and more unguarded. And it changed his face in a way that moved through Pearl like light through a window. They sat together in the shop until it was fully dark outside, talking about easier things now, the particular relief of having said the difficult thing. And when Pearl finally stood to go home, he walked with her to Mrs. Whitmore's door, and they stood on the porch in the cold December air. "Pearl," he said. "Yes." "Merry Christmas." She laughed softly. "Merry Christmas, Benjamin." She went inside and stood in the hallway for a full minute with her back against the door and the cold still on her face, and something blooming in her chest that she had no interest in suppressing at all. He began to call on her formally in January, with Mrs. Whitmore's knowledge and approval, which Pearl found she cared about, because she respected Mrs. Whitmore, and because she understood that in 1878 in a small frontier town, the proprieties of a thing mattered not for their own sake, but for the sake of the woman's position, and she had enough stability now to want to protect it. On Sunday afternoons Benjamin would come to the boarding house and they would walk through the town together, or in poor weather they would sit in Mrs. Whitmore's parlor with the door open and the fire going, which was perfectly respectable. Alma Brent, who had become Pearl's closest friend in Caldwell, was transparently delighted. "I knew it," she said one morning over breakfast. "From the first week you were here I could tell." "You could tell nothing," Pearl said. "There was nothing to tell." "There was something to tell," Alma said comfortably, spreading her bread. "You lit up when you mentioned the shop, every single morning." Pearl decided not to argue the point. Their courtship was exactly what Benjamin had promised, careful and honest and conducted with the clear eyes of two adults who had both been through enough to know the value of what they were building. They talked about everything, their histories and their fears and their hopes and the practical realities of their lives. Benjamin owned his building. He had savings. The shop was doing well. Pearl's organizational system had in fact increased his efficiency significantly, and the false rumors Alderton had spread had largely dissipated by January, with most of his customers returned, and 2 new accounts from ranchers who had heard good things. Benjamin had thought about what came next, about the future, and he was not afraid to say so directly, which Pearl found she loved about him. He was not a man who hinted at things. He said what he meant. One Sunday afternoon in February, walking along the creek south of town where the ice was beginning to break up at the edges, Benjamin stopped and turned to her. "I want to ask you something," he said. The creek water moved under the thinning ice, visible in places, dark and purposeful. "Ask," Pearl said. "Are you happy here?" he said. "In Caldwell with the way things are." She thought about it honestly. "I am," she said, "more than I expected to be when I arrived." "Would you want to stay?" He said, "Permanently, put down roots here." Pearl looked at the creek for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think I would." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I'd like to make the shop larger. There's a vacant lot next to the building that I can buy from the town for a fair price. I want to expand into a proper ranch supply operation, not just tack and repair. It would mean a good deal of work and some financial risk in the short term." "The ledgers support the expansion," Pearl said immediately. Your profit margin over the last 2 quarters has been consistently above what you'd need to service a modest loan." He stared at her for a moment, and then he did something unexpected. He laughed, a long, genuine, delighted laugh, and he reached out and took her hand, and Pearl let him, and his hand was warm and large and held hers with a careful firmness that was exactly right. "Pearl Grayson," he said, still laughing slightly, "I was trying to make a romantic declaration and you gave me a financial analysis." She looked at him steadily. "It can be both," she said. "The finances support the declaration." He lifted her hand and held it between both of his, still smiling, and looked at her with those changeable eyes that had become, over these months, one of the things she was most familiar with in the world. "Will you marry me?" he said. The creek moved. A bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods. The February sky was pale and enormous. "Yes," Pearl said. "I will." He pulled her toward him carefully, as if checking that this was welcome, and she went willingly, and he held her with his arms around her properly for the first time, and Pearl put her face against the wool of his coat and breathed him in, leather and wood smoke and clean cotton, and felt the world rearrange itself around this new fact. They were married in April, in the small church with the listing steeple, on a morning when the plains were beginning to go green, and the air smelled of new grass. Alma Brent was Pearl's witness, bright-eyed and emotional in equal measure, and Benjamin's witness was a man named Caleb Thorne who had ridden with him on cattle drives and was now ranching 40 miles east of Caldwell, a big quiet man who shook Pearl's hand at the reception with genuine warmth and said, "I've never seen him look the way he looks right now," which was the kindest wedding gift she received. Mrs. Whitmore hosted the wedding supper at the boarding house and contributed an entire ham and 4 pies, which was extravagant by her own reckoning, and which meant more to Pearl than anything she could have bought. Consuelo from the eating establishment sent over tamales and a pot of her extraordinary soup, and Mr. Sully contributed a bottle of decent wine that he had been keeping for a special occasion. And the whole evening was warm and good and full of the particular noise of people who are genuinely glad for 2 of their own. Pearl moved her carpetbag out of Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house and into the rooms above the shop, which Benjamin had been quietly preparing for months without telling her. He had built a proper kitchen shelf and installed a new stove and hung curtains in the bedroom windows, which were plain cotton but clean and white, and Pearl stood in the doorway of those rooms on their wedding evening and felt something she could only call arrived, finally and completely arrived, in a place that was hers. "You made it home," she said, looking around. "We made it home," he said from behind her. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, watching her in the rooms he had made, and his face was so entirely unguarded and full of feeling that Pearl felt her throat tighten. "Come in," she said. "It's your home too." "Ours," he said. "That's what I want you to remember. Whatever happened before, this one is ours." She went to him and took his hat and set it on the hook by the door, and he put his arms around her in the home they had made from nothing, and Pearl finally, completely, let herself believe in it. The summer of 1879 was the best of Pearl's life. She said this privately to herself, not wanting to tempt fate by saying it aloud, but it was simply true. The expanded shop came into being, with Benjamin and 2 hired men tearing down the fence between the original building and the vacant lot in June, and building out the new space over the course of 8 weeks. Pearl managed the books through the expansion with the careful attention she brought to everything, tracking costs and projections and the new inventory required for the expanded stock. And by September, the larger Crawford Ranch supply and tack was open and drawing customers from further out in the county. She worked fewer formal hours now, since the expansion had justified hiring a young man named Eli to handle the shop floor under Benjamin's direction. But she remained the keeper of the books and the one who understood the financial life of the business in its finest detail. It was work that fit her, that used her actual mind, and she was grateful for it in the same way she was grateful for everything in her life now, not lightly, not as a matter of course, but with the specific gratitude of someone who knows what the alternative looks like. Alma Brent came to dinner on Sunday evenings, a habit they had established before the wedding and continued after, and Pearl loved those evenings, the three of them around the kitchen table with good food and honest conversation. Alma was thriving in her schoolroom and had grown into a significant presence in the town, and she had her own story developing quietly, a particular attentiveness she paid to the letters she received from a cousin's husband's younger brother, who was a schoolmaster in Wichita, and who, Alma admitted with uncharacteristic color in her cheeks, wrote very good letters. Pearl encouraged this with the warmth of a woman who knows that happiness is not a fixed amount that runs out. In the early fall of 1879, Pearl understood that she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Benjamin, not out of fear but out of the desire to hold it by herself first, to feel the shape of it and make sure she was ready to speak it aloud. On the 4th evening after supper, while they were sitting together in the lamplight, Benjamin reading a stock list and Pearl at her desk with the accounts, she simply said, "Benjamin." He looked up. "We're going to have a baby," she said. The stock list went down. He looked at her for a long moment and she watched the information move through him, his face going through something she could not entirely track, something large and complicated and real, and then he stood up and came to her desk and crouched down in front of her chair and took both her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he said. His voice was very gentle. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I've been well for weeks." He let out a long breath, and then he pressed his forehead against her clasped hands for a moment. And when he looked up, his eyes were bright, and she understood that this was as big for him as it was for her, that the man who had lost his entire family at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, and in a fever bed in Tennessee, was being given something back that he had not let himself want openly. "Pearl," he said. "I know," she said. He kissed her hands and then her forehead and then her cheek, and then, eventually properly, and they sat together in the lamplight for a long time without needing to say anything at all, because everything that needed saying was already known between them. Their son was born in May of 1880, which was the beginning of a busy cattle season in Caldwell, and which meant the whole town was awake and moving when the Crawford baby arrived in the world. He was healthy and loudly opinionated about his arrival, which made the midwife, a woman named Mrs. Dawes, laugh with approval, and he had Benjamin's dark hair and Pearl's gray eyes, and he was, in Pearl's considered opinion, the most remarkable thing she had ever seen. They named him Thomas James Crawford, Thomas for Pearl's brother, which was a gesture of forgiveness that cost her something and therefore mattered, and James for Benjamin's father, and they called him Tommy from the first day, because that was simply what he was. Benjamin held his son with the carefulness of a man handling the most important thing he had ever been given, which was exactly what it was, and Pearl watched him do this from the bed where she was propped against 3 pillows, tired in every bone and more content than she had words for. "He's fierce," Benjamin said, looking down at the small, outraged face. "He comes by it honestly," Pearl said. Benjamin looked up at her with that unguarded face she had come to love most, the one he kept only for her and now, it seemed, for their son. Life in the 3 years that followed was a full and particular thing. Tommy grew into a child of genuine character, curious and stubborn and physically fearless in ways that required constant vigilance, with a laugh that Benjamin said was entirely Pearl's, and a tendency to argue with everything that Pearl said was entirely Benjamin's. The shop continued to grow. Eli, the young shop floor man, proved himself so capable and reliable that Benjamin eventually made him a partner in the supply side of the business, which freed Benjamin to focus on the craft work, the saddle making and repair that was his real expertise, and that had begun to attract customers from as far as Wichita. Pearl ran the finances of the expanded partnership with the same careful precision she brought to everything, and she had also, in those years, become something of a resource for several of the other women in town who were trying to manage household finances or small businesses, and who came to her sometimes with their ledgers and their confusion. And Pearl helped them because it cost her nothing and mattered to them considerably. She understood in doing this what she had not understood when she arrived in Caldwell, that the thing she had to offer was not a property or a family name or a history. It was her particular way of seeing clearly and thinking carefully and working steadily and loving without pretense, that these were real things and that they had worth, and that she had brought them into the life she and Benjamin had built the way a craftsman brings his best tools, with care and purpose. She thought of what he had said to her in the shop on Christmas afternoon in 1878. "You already gave me something I cannot name." She understood now what he had been trying to name. It was this, exactly this, the presence of a person who sees the world honestly and meets it without flinching, and makes the life around her more true simply by being themselves. She had not known she was doing it. She had simply been herself because she had nothing else left to be. And that had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything. In the summer of 1883, Thomas Crawford, who was the justice of the peace in Caldwell and a man of considerable good sense, came to Benjamin with a proposition. The county was growing. The cattle trade had shifted somewhat, with Caldwell losing some of its preeminence to other towns as the trail routes changed. But the surrounding ranching community was establishing itself permanently, and there was a real need for a proper ranch supply operation that could serve the region as a whole. He and two other businessmen were proposing a supply collective, a cooperative arrangement between Crawford Ranch Supply and Tack and two other operations, and they wanted Benjamin as the central partner given his expertise and reputation. Benjamin came home that evening and told Pearl about it at the kitchen table while Tommy, now 3 years old and deeply interested in a piece of leather scrap his father had given him, occupied himself on the floor nearby. Pearl listened to the entire proposal before she said anything. Then she said, "Tell me what their offered terms are exactly," he told her. She got up and got the large ledger that covered the current state of the business and sat back down, and they went through the numbers together, methodically, the way they had learned to make all their significant decisions, in full partnership with everything on the table. "The collective makes sense financially," Pearl said after an hour of careful work. "The risk is manageable against your current reserves and Eli's equity. The terms are favorable to you. The main variable is how much of your time it will take." "More time," Benjamin said. "That means less time in the shop, less time on the craft work." He was quiet. "Is the craft work something you're willing to scale back?" Pearl asked. She asked it genuinely, not leading him anywhere because this was his particular love, the leather work, the making of things with his hands. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Then that's the thing to decide before the business terms," Pearl said. He looked at her across the table. Tommy had fallen asleep on his piece of leather on the floor, and the lamplight was soft and the shop below them was quiet and closed. "You always find the actual question," Benjamin said. "It's just clear thinking," Pearl said. "No," he said. "It's you. It's how you think. I've never had that kind of clarity about myself before you. I used to make decisions on instinct and hope and stubbornness. Now I actually understand what I'm deciding and why." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "That's not nothing, Pearl. That's most of what I am now." She turned her hand under his and held it. "Take the partnership if it's what you want," she said. "We'll find ways to protect your time in the shop. Maybe Eli takes more of the supply floor entirely. Maybe we hire someone for the bookkeeping so I can take over more of the correspondence." She thought for a moment. "You're 35 years old and you've built something remarkable. You should be able to expand it on your terms." 35 is not old," he said. "I didn't say it was old," she said. "I said it was remarkable." He smiled at her, that warm, unguarded smile. "We could also expand the family," he said, very carefully, with the particular care that he always brought to something he wanted but would not push. Pearl looked at him. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "Tommy needs someone to argue with other than the dog," Benjamin said. Their dog was a large mongrel named Reckless, who had appeared at the shop door one morning in 1881 and made himself at home with such complete conviction that they had never seriously tried to remove him. Pearl laughed, the genuine laugh that she had discovered she had again in this life, the one that came from somewhere real. "I think Tommy is doing fine arguing with the dog," she said. "But all right, yes, I'd like that too." Benjamin went to the collective proposal the next morning and accepted the terms with two modifications that Pearl had identified as improvable and that the other partners agreed to without difficulty. Crawford Ranch Supply and Tack became the anchor of the new Caldwell Ranchers Supply Cooperative, which was a proper and substantial enterprise, and Benjamin retained his shop and his leather work, protected now by Eli's excellent management of the expanded supply operation. And Pearl discovered in the late fall of 1883 that she was expecting again. The second pregnancy was harder than the first. She was nauseous well into the 5th month and tired in a way she managed with characteristic stubbornness, refusing to slow down more than necessary, but accepting Benjamin's help with a grace that she had not fully possessed the first time around. He was attentive without being suffocating, which was the specific kind of attention she needed, and he took over the cooking entirely during the months when smells were a problem, and did it without complaint and with a competence that surprised her, because it turned out that a man who cooked on cattle drives for years could feed a household adequately when required. Their daughter was born in June of 1884, on a warm and beautiful morning when the whole Kansas plain was brilliant with summer, and the town of Caldwell had become, over 6 years, genuinely theirs. They named her Eleanor Jane Crawford, Eleanor for no particular person but simply because it was beautiful and suited her, and Jane for Pearl's mother. And from the very first days of Eleanor's life, Tommy, who was 4 now and full of opinions, decided that she was his primary responsibility and took this role with a seriousness that made both Benjamin and Pearl quietly undone with love for him. Eleanor had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which was visible from approximately the first month of her life in the way she refused to be put down, when she wanted to be held and demanded acknowledgement of her opinions at a volume that impressed Mrs. Dawes, who had now delivered both Crawford children, and said she had never attended a more opinionated family. The summer of 1884 was full and warm and good in the way that summers can be when a life has found its proper shape. Pearl was 30 years old, and when she walked through the town of Caldwell on a July afternoon with Benjamin beside her and Tommy trotting ahead and Eleanor in her arms, she felt the particular solidity of a life that has been built rather than given, that has been chosen rather than inherited, that has cost something real and is therefore real in return. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach in the summer of 1878 with a faded carpetbag and $4.30, so stripped down by loss that she had barely a self left to stand on. She thought about her with something that was not quite pity and not quite pride, but something that acknowledged both the cost and the survival and the unexpected grace of where it had all led. She mentioned this one evening to Benjamin, sitting on the small porch they had added to the back of the building above the shop, looking out over the Kansas grassland that turned golden in the late evening light. Eleanor was asleep inside. Tommy was attempting to teach Reckless to sit, with limited success. "When I came here," Pearl said, "I thought I had lost myself entirely. I thought there was nothing left of me worth offering anyone." Benjamin was quiet beside her, his shoulder against hers. "And now," he said, "and now I understand that what I thought was loss was actually just everything unnecessary being taken away," Pearl said, "and what was left was the actual essential thing, which was enough, which turned out to be more than enough." "It was everything," Benjamin said. "You said something to me on Christmas afternoon in 1878, Pearl said. "You said I had given you something you could not name. Do you remember?" "I remember every word," he said. "What would you call it now?" she asked. "After all this, "What is the name for it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Reckless barked once at Tommy's instruction and then immediately forgot why and wandered off to smell a fence post, and Tommy said something reproachful and very serious to him. "Home," Benjamin said finally. "The name for it is home. You gave me a home, not the building. You gave me the sense of a place I belong entirely and am known without having to explain myself. I hadn't had that since Tennessee. I wasn't sure I'd ever have it again." Pearl leaned her head against his shoulder. "You gave me the same thing," she said. "You just did it first." He put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the golden Kansas evening and watched their son lecture their dog and listened to the quiet breathing of their sleeping daughter through the open window and felt the full and specific weight of everything they had made from nothing and for which they had no simpler word than this: home. Jim Alderton's cattle brokerage, which he had established after failing to acquire Benjamin's building, had stumbled through 3 difficult years before closing entirely in 1881. Alderton himself had left Caldwell for Wichita, and Benjamin had not celebrated this and Pearl had not either, because they were not people who needed their enemies diminished to feel secure. The town had moved on. The shop had grown. There was nothing left of that particular shadow. The cooperative continued to expand through the mid-1880s, and Benjamin was increasingly recognized as one of the more significant businessmen in the county, which he wore with the same matter-of-fact lack of pretension that characterized everything about him. He was elected to the town council in 1885, which he had not sought and accepted with mild reluctance, and then threw himself into with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. Pearl was made the cooperative's official financial manager in 1886, a paid position that recognized formally what had been true informally for years. She sat at meetings with ranchers and merchants and cattle buyers, the only woman at most of those tables, and she did not make any particular issue of this. She brought the numbers and the analysis and the clear thinking and let the work speak, and it spoke loudly enough that within a year no one thought of questioning her presence at the table, because she was simply too useful and too right too consistently for the question to survive. There were injustices in those years that Pearl did not look away from. She saw the way the Cheyenne and Arapaho people who were still in the region were treated, the way their land had been systematically reduced, and their lives constrained by policies made in Washington by men who had never seen this country. She saw the particular condition of the black cowboys who worked the trail drives and contributed to every aspect of the cattle economy, and were paid less, and housed separately, and accorded less dignity than their white counterparts. And she knew there was no clean resolution to any of this within the reach of her own small life. But she was not a woman who pretended injustice was not happening because it was inconvenient to acknowledge. She said what she thought when she was in rooms where it mattered and gave her business to the people who did fair work regardless of who they were, and she raised her children to see clearly and treat people as people, which was the most foundational thing she knew how to give them. Benjamin shared her view of these things, which was one more way they were matched that she had not anticipated when she first walked into his shop. He had ridden the trail drives alongside men of every background, and knew from direct experience that character had nothing to do with color or origin, and said so plainly when the subject arose, which in 1880s Kansas required a certain fortitude that he had and deployed without theatrics. In the spring of 1887, Alma Brent, who was now Alma Forsyth, having finally married her correspondent schoolmaster from Wichita in a ceremony 2 years earlier, came to visit with her husband Gerald and their infant son, and Pearl's house was full for a week with the particular joy of close friendship, the way old friends take up exactly where they left off no matter how much time has passed. Alma was as bright and earnest as ever, now with more experience behind the brightness and a happiness about her that Pearl recognized because she felt it herself. They sat at the kitchen table one afternoon while the men were in the shop, and the children were arranged in the yard under the eye of Mrs. Dawes' niece, who helped with the children several days a week. "Do you remember when I asked you on your first night at supper if you were meeting someone here?" Alma said, cradling her coffee. "I remember," Pearl said. "You said no with such complete finality," Alma said. "And then within a month you were lighting up every morning when you talked about the shop." "You've told me this before," Pearl said fondly. "I like being right," Alma said. "I don't get to be right about everything, so I appreciate the instances where I clearly am." She looked at Pearl over her coffee cup, and her expression shifted to something warmer and quieter. "You are very happy," she said. "I mean it genuinely. You are one of the happiest people I know, Pearl, and you were one of the most exhausted and lost people I had ever seen when you first arrived. Watching that change has been one of the best things in my life." Pearl held her coffee cup and looked at her friend. "I didn't know I could be this," she said, "happy in this particular way. I thought the most I could hope for was stability, a room of my own, work that was mine. I didn't think I'd get this." "What is this to you?" Alma asked. Pearl thought about it carefully, the way she always thought about important things. "This is being known," she said finally. "Entirely known and wanted anyway, by a person and a place. I'm known here by Benjamin, by the children, by the people in this town. I'm not a stranger anymore. I'm not someone passing through." She set her cup down. "That's what I thought I'd never have again. And I have it. I have it completely." Alma reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and Pearl squeezed back, and they sat together in the warm kitchen in the spring of 1887 in Caldwell, Kansas, and were quietly and completely glad. The years that followed arranged themselves with the particular texture of a life that is genuinely lived rather than survived. Tommy grew into a boy of serious purpose and considerable humor, interested in the leather craft in a way that delighted his father. And by the time he was 8, he could be found in the shop after school learning to work the smaller tools under Benjamin's patient instruction. Elena grew into a girl of fierce intelligence and strong opinions, who loved books with a passion that Pearl recognized and encouraged with everything available to her, which included Alma's book donations from Wichita and a correspondence Pearl established with a lending library that sent volumes by post once a month. In 1888, Pearl found herself expecting their third child, which had not been particularly planned, but which was greeted with uncomplicated joy by everyone involved, including Tommy, who had grown old enough to understand what was happening, and Elena, who was 4 and primarily interested in the baby as a potential audience for her many opinions. The third child arrived in January of 1889, a second boy, healthy and considerable in size, who they named William Henry Crawford, William for Benjamin's lost brother and Henry for no particular person, but because it was solid and suited the weight of the child in their arms. Benjamin held William with the same careful reverence he had brought to holding Tommy 9 years earlier, and Pearl saw in his face the same complicated gratitude, the particular wonder of a man who had been given back things he had believed permanently lost. "William," Benjamin said softly, looking at the small face. "He would have been glad," Pearl said. Benjamin looked at her. "My brother?" "Yes," she said. "He would have been very glad for all of this." Benjamin's jaw worked for a moment. Then he nodded once and looked back at his son, and Pearl knew that she had given him something with those words that was not small, the permission to feel both the joy and the grief in the same moment, which was sometimes the most truthful thing available. Caldwell continued to change through the end of the decade. The cattle drives along the Chisholm Trail diminished significantly after 1889 as the open range gave way to fenced pastures, and the railroad made the long drives less necessary, and the town's character shifted from the wild commerce of a trail town to something quieter and more permanently rooted. Several businesses closed. Others adapted. The Caldwell Ranchers Supply Cooperative, largely because of the soundness of its financial management and the breadth of its membership, survived and adapted well, shifting its focus from trail drive supplies to the needs of established ranching operations and the farming homesteaders who were moving steadily into the region. Benjamin expanded his leather craft significantly in these years, now that the shop floor was entirely Eli's domain, and his own time was freed for the work he loved most. He began to take commissions from wealthy ranchers in Kansas and Texas for custom saddles, work that was extraordinary by any measure, and that carried his reputation beyond Caldwell to a much wider world. He had a waiting list by 1890, which he managed with Pearl's help, and which meant that the shop, now purely a craft operation on his end, generated more income per square foot than it ever had in the supply days. Pearl turned 36 in the spring of 1890 and felt entirely herself, completely herself, in a way she had not felt since before her father's death, since before the farm was taken and Thomas turned her out and the world had reduced her to her smallest self. She felt large now, full of her own life, competent and loved and rooted, and she understood that the rooting had come from inside as much as from outside, that she had done the work of putting down her own foundations, one careful, honest day at a time, and that Benjamin had done the same, and that together they had built something that neither of them could have built alone. On the evening of their 12th wedding anniversary in April of 1890, Benjamin arranged for Mrs. Dawes' niece to stay with the children and took Pearl to supper at the best eating establishment Caldwell had to offer, which was Consulo's daughter's establishment, Consulo herself having retired 2 years earlier and turned the kitchen over to her daughter Maria, who was equally gifted and had added a few refinements of her own. They ate an extraordinary meal and drank good wine and talked with the ease of two people who have learned each other completely and still find each other interesting. After supper they walked home through the spring evening, the Kansas sky enormous overhead, the first stars beginning to appear, and the smell of the plains in spring, new grass and distant rain, all around them. Pearl stopped at the door of their home above the shop and looked up at the sign that said Crawford Ranch Supply and Tack, which Benjamin had not changed despite the nature of the business having evolved, because he liked the continuity of it. "Do you remember the first time I walked through that door?" she said. "I remember exactly," he said. "I thought you were Hendricks," she laughed, "and I thought here is a shop that could use some organization." "It could," he agreed. "And a man who could use someone to tell him where he actually stands," Pearl said. "He could," Benjamin said. "He very much could." She turned to look at him in the spring evening, 12 years of marriage in her body and her history, 3 children sleeping inside, a life built from nothing by 2 people who had both arrived at their lowest and chosen to trust each other with what remained. "You asked me once if just being all right was enough for me," she said. "Do you remember?" "The night it was snowing," he said immediately. "Yes." She looked at him, this man she had chosen and been chosen by, whose hands she knew and whose face she knew and whose particular quality of listening had never diminished in 12 years. "Being all right is not what this is," she said. "I want you to know that. This is not just all right. This is everything." He took her face in his hands, those large, careful hands, and looked at her the way he always had, without pretense, without performance, entirely present. "Pearl Grayson Crawford," he said. "You walked into my shop and you gave me something I could not name, and I have spent 12 years learning what it was, and it is you, entirely and exactly you, and I would not trade a single day of it." She put her hands over his. "Come inside," she said. "Come home." They went in together, through the door of the life they had made, and the Kansas night closed around the building, warm and real, and the stars came fully out over the plains. And in the 3 rooms above the shop, their children slept the easy sleep of children who are entirely safe and entirely loved. And Pearl Crawford, who had once stepped off a stagecoach with a faded carpetbag and $4.30 and the belief that she had nothing left to offer, sat in the lamplight of her home and understood that she had always been wrong about that. She had herself, and herself had been, from the very beginning, the most extraordinary thing in the room. The spring of 1892 brought the most beautiful season Caldwell had seen in years, with rains that turned the prairie a brilliant living green and wildflowers along the creek beds in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. And Pearl, who had loved that creek since the day Benjamin had proposed to her beside it in the February cold 14 years before, walked its banks often in those weeks with Alina, now 8 and full of questions about every plant and creature they encountered. Tommy was 12 and spending more and more of his time in his father's workshop, learning the leather craft with a dedication that had gone beyond childhood interest into genuine apprenticeship. And Benjamin taught him with the same patience and precision he brought to everything, clearly proud in the way that parents are when they see a child grow into something real. Tommy had his father's hands, large and careful, and his mother's perfectionism, and the combination was already producing work that was better than what most adult craftsmen managed. William was 3 and a complete personality, louder and more sociable than either of his older siblings had been, with a gift for making people laugh and a stubbornness about napping that had tested every member of the household's resolve at various points. He followed Reckless around with a devotion that the old dog bore with great patience, and the two of them together, the large sleepy dog and the small determined boy, were a sight that made Pearl laugh every time. On a warm evening in May of that year, Pearl and Benjamin sat on their back porch after the children were in bed, and the prairie was full of cricket sound and the distant low of cattle from the Henderson Ranch to the east, and the air was sweet with whatever was blooming along the creek. "I want to tell you something," Pearl said. "Tell me," Benjamin said. "I have been thinking about the schoolhouse," Pearl said. "Miss Kirkland is leaving at the end of the school year. She's going back to Ohio to care for her mother." "I heard," he said. "I've been speaking with the school board," Pearl said. "They need someone to take over the bookkeeping for the school district, not teaching. Administrative, financial management, correspondence, reporting. It's a few hours a week, but it would be a proper formal position." "Are you thinking of taking it?" Benjamin asked. "I'm thinking I'd like to offer," Pearl said. "It would mean some reorganization of my time, but the children are older. Mrs. Dawes' niece is reliable, and I think I would do the work well." "You would do it brilliantly," Benjamin said without any hesitation. "You should absolutely take it if it's what you want." Pearl smiled. This was one of the true things about their marriage, the way they did not diminish each other's ambitions, the way they each understood that the other was a full person with purposes beyond the family they had made together, and that honoring those purposes made the family stronger, not weaker. "It's what I want," she said. "Then it's settled," he said. She took the school district position that fall and found it satisfying in exactly the way she had expected, the particular pleasure of bringing order to a financial situation that had been managed haphazardly, and seeing it become clean and clear and functional. The school board, which was composed of 3 men who had various degrees of skepticism about a woman in the role, was persuaded within 2 months by the simple evidence of her work, which was thorough and correct, and presented so clearly that it could not be argued with. The years rolled through the early 1890s with the fullness of lives that have found their proper shape. Benjamin's leather work reputation extended into neighboring states. Pearl's financial management of the cooperative and the school district made her one of the most functionally important people in the county, a fact that several people pointed out publicly, and that she received with the same matter-of-fact steadiness she brought to everything. Tommy, at 15, was doing work in his father's shop that brought customers in specifically to commission pieces from the young Crawford, and Benjamin watched this with a pride that Pearl sometimes caught on his face when he thought no one was observing, and she loved him intensely in those moments. Alina at 11 was the best student in Caldwell's schoolhouse, which made Pearl quietly and completely delighted, and was also in correspondence with the library in Wichita on her own account now, which had required a degree of negotiation with the librarian that Alina had conducted herself with complete competence. William at 7 had decided that he wanted to be a rancher when he grew up, and he approached this ambition with the same seriousness that his siblings brought to their various passions, quizzing his father on cattle and land management with an exactness that made Benjamin answer carefully, knowing he was being studied. In the fall of 1895, Benjamin's health was briefly uncertain. A fever came on him in September and did not break cleanly, and for 2 weeks Pearl was frightened in a way she had not been since the early days of her life, the fear of losing something essential. She managed it the way she managed everything, by doing the work that was in front of her, by making sure the right remedies were applied, and the doctor was consulted, and the children were cared for, and the household ran, and by sitting beside Benjamin in the evenings with her hand in his, and not sleeping well and not admitting to anyone how frightened she was. He recovered, as she had told herself he would, because he was fundamentally a strong and healthy man, and the fever was not the kind that killed strong men in their 40s if they were properly cared for. And when he was fully himself again and sitting at the supper table one October evening, eating Consuelo's granddaughter's soup with the appetite of a man, returned to himself. Pearl looked at him across the table and felt the particular gratitude of a person who has come close enough to the edge to see clearly over it and been pulled back. "You were worried," he said, looking at her. "I was not worried," she said. "Pearl," he said. "I was extremely worried," she admitted. He reached across the table and covered her hand. Tommy and Alina and William were at the table and pretended not to notice this, each in their different ways. Tommy by being very interested in his bowl, and Alina by looking out the window, and William by saying something about cows that drew everyone's attention admirably. "I'm here," Benjamin said quietly, just for her, under the clamor of the table. "Yes," she said. "I know, I'm glad." The years settled back into their rhythm, and the fear faded into the category of things that had happened and been survived, which was where Pearl kept everything that had been survived. It did not disappear, but it found its proper place, which was in the past, behind the present reality of Benjamin entirely well and working in his shop, and coming up the stairs in the evening smelling of leather and wood smoke, and entirely himself. Caldwell continued to change with the decade, the wildness of the trail town years now firmly in the past, and the town settling into the identity of a permanent agricultural community, which suited Pearl exactly. She had never wanted the wildness, only the rootedness, and she had it completely. In 1897, Tommy, who was 17, made his first entirely independent saddle commission, a piece ordered by a rancher in Texas who had heard of Benjamin Crawford's son and wanted to see what the younger Crawford could do. Tommy produced a saddle that was, in the rancher's written response, the finest he had ever owned, which was the kind of praise that rarely comes unsolicited and meant what it said. Benjamin brought Tommy's commission response to the supper table and read it aloud, and then simply put his hand on his son's shoulder and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. Pearl watched this and felt the fullness of the moment press against her chest in the best possible way. Alina at 13 had already declared her intention to attend a women's college in the East, and Pearl, who had found her own competence in arithmetic tables at a farmhouse kitchen in Missouri with her father pointing over her shoulder, thought that Alina should have every path available to her, and began corresponding with institutions to understand what would be required. Benjamin supported this without reservation, because he had always been, a man who believed in the full capability of the women in his life without needing a particular philosophy to justify it, simply from direct observation of what people could do when given the chance. The century turned, and with it came the particular feeling of having passed through one era and entered another, and Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1900 was a different place than the Caldwell of 1878, though many of the bones of the place were the same. The general store was still run by the Sully family, though old Abe had passed, and his son now stood behind the counter. The church steeple had been repaired years ago and no longer listed. The Red Spur Saloon had become a quieter establishment as the wild years receded, and many of the buildings on the main street had been replaced or renovated. Crawford Ranch Supply and Tax still stood exactly where it had always stood, its sign unchanged, though the shop itself was Benjamin's craft operation exclusively now, a place of recognized excellence whose output was sought by people who understood the difference between good work and extraordinary work. Tommy worked beside his father most days, a young man of 19 with his own reputation growing steadily, and the two Crawfords, senior and junior, produced work that people in 3 states could identify by its quality. Pearl, who was 46 years old in 1900, managed the financial interests of the Crawford operation, the school district, and a third of the businesses on Caldwell's Main Street, who had learned over the years that she was the most reliable financial mind in the county, and were glad to pay her appropriately for the privilege. She had gray at her temples now, which she had not tried to conceal, and the lines around her eyes that came from years of careful looking, and she was, in the opinion of everyone who knew her, one of the most capable and complete people in the county. William, who was 11 and extremely interested in horses, had begun to make himself useful at the Henderson Ranch to the east, going there after school on Saturdays with Benjamin's permission, and learning the animal side of the ranching business with the same focused attention his older brother brought to leather. Benjamin called this managing the Crawford educational investment across multiple disciplines, which made Pearl laugh, and William called it more fun than anything, which was equally honest. Eleanor was 16 and corresponding with Wellesley College in Massachusetts, a project that Pearl supported with the full weight of her organizational ability and her complete belief in her daughter's capability. Eleanor was going to go to college. Pearl had decided this and was working toward it with the same steady purpose she brought to everything that mattered. On a warm September evening in 1900, Pearl and Benjamin sat on their back porch in the soft end-of-summer dark, and the prairie stretched away from them to the horizon in the last of the evening light, and the sound of Caldwell, their town, their particular and chosen place in the world, came to them faintly and reckless, who had been replaced some years ago by a younger dog of similar character named Steady, lay at their feet and breathed contentedly. "Do you ever think about what it looked like," Pearl said, "the day I walked into that shop?" "Often," Benjamin said. "I think you were wearing a blue dress." "The gray one," she said. "The blue one wore out in 1879. "I think it was blue," he said. "It was gray," she said firmly. "I had one blue dress and I was saving it." "Then it was gray," he said agreeably, because he had learned over 22 years of marriage that Pearl's memory for factual detail was invariably more reliable than his. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat with the prairie and the evening and the 22 years of everything they had built between them. "I came here with nothing," she said. She said it not as a sad thing but as a starting point, the way you describe the foundation before you describe the building. "You came here with yourself," Benjamin said. "That was never nothing. It was the only thing that mattered." Pearl was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I know that now, I didn't know it then." "Neither of us knew things we know now," he said. "That seems to be the arrangement," she smiled. "What do you still not know?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything she asked him. "I still don't know," he said, "how it's possible to know a person as completely as I know you and still find them genuinely surprising." Pearl turned to look at him. "You surprised me last week," he said, "when you stood up at the cooperative meeting and told Hendricks exactly what his pricing model would do to the smaller ranchers in 3 years. I've watched you work for 22 years and you still surprise me." "Hendricks was wrong," Pearl said. "He was, and you showed him so in front of everyone with complete calm," Benjamin said. "You've always done that, you've never performed it, you just do it." Pearl looked at the prairie. "You gave me a place where I could do it," she said. "That's what you gave me, a place where being entirely myself was not a problem to be managed but a thing to be glad for. I didn't know that was available. I had never had it before. "You deserved it always," he said simply. She turned back to him. This man she had chosen on a Christmas afternoon in a leather shop 22 years ago, who had looked at her with honest eyes and told her she had given him something he could not name. And she understood again, as she had understood many times in the years since, that she had been wrong about having nothing to offer. What she had offered was herself, honest and careful and alive to things, and it had been, from the very first morning she walked through that shop door, the only thing that had ever truly mattered. "Come inside," she said. "It's getting cold." He rose and offered her his hand, the way he always did, and she took it, the way she always did, and they went into the warm light of their home together. Inside, Tommy was at the kitchen table with a piece of leather he was tooling by lamplight. Eleanor was reading, a book from the most recent library delivery, pulled up close to her lamp with the focused intensity she brought to everything she loved. William was presumably sleeping, as he was required to do at 11 on a school night, though Pearl suspected he was reading under his blanket with a candle stub, which was a habit she recognized from its origins in herself. The house smelled of supper and warm wood, and the particular scent of the leather oil Tommy was using, and Steady lifted his head from his place by the stove and then put it back down, satisfied. Benjamin squeezed her hand before releasing it, and she felt the warmth of it stay on her palm even after, the way certain things do when they are exactly right. Pearl Crawford stood in the kitchen of the life she had built and let herself feel the full weight of it, all of it, not the cleaned-up version or the simplified version but the true version, everything it had cost and everything it had given back and everything it still was, right now, in this moment, complete and full and hers. 22 years ago she had told herself she had nothing to offer. 22 years ago a cowboy in a leather shop had told her she was wrong, that she had already given him something he could not name. The name had been this, all of this, every single piece of it, and she would have if she could have traveled back to that day on the stagecoach and spoken to the woman with the faded carpetbag and the $4.30 and the exhausted eyes, she would have told her, "Hold on. Hold on and go forward and be exactly who you are, because who you are is going to be enough. It is going to be more than enough. It is going to be everything." She put the kettle on for the last cup of tea of the evening, and Tommy looked up from his leather work and said something about the stitching he was struggling with. And she went to look because she always looked when her children asked. And Benjamin came to look too because he could not help himself. And the three of them stood at the kitchen table in the lamplight in Caldwell, Kansas, at the turn of the new century, and the night outside was full of stars over the prairie. And inside the house was full of everything that mattered. The door was closed. The life was complete. The story had an ending that was also a beginning, the way all the best endings are, pointing forward into the ordinary miraculous continuation of everything they had built and everything still to come. Pearl Crawford set her hand on her son's shoulder and felt him lean into it just slightly, the way he still did sometimes despite being 19 and several inches taller than her. And she was glad, entirely and specifically and completely glad, and that was the whole of it. That was exactly the whole of it.